Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of our English Learning podcast. I'm Jennifer, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Elizabeth. How are you today, Elizabeth?
Hi, Jennifer. I'm doing great, thank you. Today's topic is one that's on a lot of people's minds these days. Is climate change already irreversible? We hear about wildfires, rising sea levels, and extreme weather events almost daily, which makes it seem like climate change is accelerating. But the big question is, have we already passed the point of no return, or is there still hope to stop or reverse some of the damage?
That's right, Elizabeth. The idea of irreversibility is a big concern for scientists, environmentalists, and policymakers alike. Some argue that the damage we've done to the planet is already too severe to fully reverse, while others believe that we still have time to mitigate the worst effects of climate change. It's a complex issue, and today we're going to break down the scientific evidence, what we can still do to adapt, and whether we should focus on mitigation or adaptation as we move forward.
Exactly. And for our listeners out there, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic. Do you think climate change is already irreversible, or do you believe we can still make a difference? Share your opinions with us, and we might even feature them in a future episode. So, Jennifer, let's start by discussing what scientists mean when they say climate change might be irreversible. What does that term really mean?
Well, Elizabeth, when scientists talk about irreversibility in the context of climate change, they're often referring to changes in the Earth's climate system that will continue even if we stop emitting greenhouse gases today. For example, ice sheet melting, sea level rise, and ocean acidification are processes that may continue for centuries, even if we dramatically reduce emissions. Some scientists argue that we've already set certain feedback loops into motion, like the melting of the Arctic ice caps, which may be impossible to fully reverse.
That's such an important point, Jennifer. Concept of climate feedback loops is key to understanding why some people believe climate change might already be irreversible. For instance, as the Arctic ice melts, less sunlight is reflected back into space because the dark ocean absorbs more heat. This, in turn, leads to more warming, which accelerates the melting of ice. Once a feedback loop like this starts, it can be very difficult to stop, and this is why some scientists worry that we're approaching or have already passed certain tipping points.
Exactly, Elizabeth. The idea of tipping points is crucial in this discussion. These are thresholds in the Earth's climate system where small changes can lead to dramatic, long-term effects. For example, the melting of the Greenland ice sheet is one of these tipping points. Once a certain amount of ice melts, it becomes almost impossible to stop the rest of it from melting, leading to irreversible sea level rise. Scientists are also concerned about the potential collapse of the Amazon rainforest or the disruption of ocean currents like the Gulf Stream, which could have massive consequences for global weather patterns.
Absolutely, Jennifer. But while some aspects of climate change may be irreversible in the short term, that doesn't mean we're powerless. There's a big difference between irreversibility and inevitability. Even if certain changes like sea level rise are locked in, we can still take action to slow down the rate of change and limit the damage. This is where the idea of mitigation comes in, taking steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and slow the rate of climate change. It's not about reversing the damage that's already been done, but about preventing things from getting worse.
Exactly, Elizabeth. Mitigation is one of the key strategies in the fight against climate change. While we may not be able to reverse certain effects, we can still limit future warming by reducing our reliance on fossil fuels, transitioning to renewable energy, and implementing policies that curb carbon emissions. For example, shifting to solar, wind, and hydroelectric power can significantly reduce our carbon footprint. If we act quickly, we can avoid the most catastrophic scenarios, even if some damage is already unavoidable.
That's such a great point, Jennifer. And in addition to mitigation, there's also the concept of adaptation, finding ways to live with the changes that are already happening. For example, coastal cities are investing in flood defenses and seawalls to protect against rising sea levels, while farmers are adopting climate-resilient crops to deal with changing weather patterns. Adaptation acknowledges that some impacts of climate change are already here, but it focuses on minimizing the damage and protecting communities.
Absolutely, Elizabeth. Adaptation is crucial because, even with the best mitigation efforts, We're going to see more extreme weather events, changes in ecosystems, and shifts in agricultural patterns. In places like Bangladesh or the Netherlands, where rising sea levels are a major threat, governments are investing in infrastructure to protect their citizens. Meanwhile, cities in California are developing strategies to cope with more frequent wildfires and droughts. These adaptation measures are essential for minimizing the human and economic toll of climate change.
Exactly, Jennifer. So, while climate change may be irreversible in some respects, that doesn't mean we should give up. Mitigation and adaptation are two key strategies that can help us manage the effects of climate change and prevent the worst-case scenarios. But of course, not everyone agrees on how to approach this issue. Some people believe that focusing on adaptation is the most practical solution, while others argue that we need to double down on mitigation to prevent things from getting worse. Let's explore both sides of this debate.
Well, Elizabeth, those who advocate for focusing on adaptation argue that some level of climate change is already inevitable and that we need to prioritize protecting people, infrastructure, and ecosystems from the impacts that are already happening. For example, they argue that it's more practical to invest in flood barriers and drought-resistant crops than to try to drastically reduce emissions in the short term, especially since global efforts to reduce emissions have been slow. In this view, adaptation is seen as a realistic and urgent response to the immediate challenges of climate change.
That's such an important point, Jennifer. The argument for adaptation often focuses on the idea that we need to prepare for the worst while still hoping for the best. Advocates believe that, given the political and economic challenges of reducing emissions on a global scale, it's more practical to focus on helping communities survive and thrive in a changing climate. This could include building stronger infrastructure, developing early warning systems for extreme weather events, and relocating vulnerable communities to safer areas.
Exactly, Elizabeth. But on the other hand, supporters of mitigation argue that we can't afford to give up on reducing emissions, even if some level of climate change is inevitable. They believe that if we don't take aggressive action now to reduce carbon emissions, the impacts of climate change will become so severe that adaptation alone won't be enough. For example, if we allow global temperatures to rise by more than 2 degrees Celsius, we could see catastrophic impacts like massive biodiversity loss, widespread food shortages, and deadly heat waves. In this view, mitigation is the only way to avoid the most dangerous outcomes.
Absolutely, Jennifer. The argument for mitigation often emphasizes that we still have a narrow window of opportunity to prevent the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. While some changes may be irreversible, we can still limit the extent of the damage by transitioning to clean energy, reducing deforestation, and investing in carbon capture technologies. Supporters of mitigation argue that the longer we wait to reduce emissions, the harder and more expensive adaptation will become.
That's such a great point, Elizabeth. Mitigation isn't just about reducing emissions. It's also about preserving ecosystems, protecting endangered species, and ensuring that future generations inherit a planet that's still livable. While adaptation is necessary, proponents of mitigation argue that it's not enough to simply adapt to a warming world. We need to take action to stop the warming from getting worse. In this view, focusing solely on adaptation is like treating the symptoms of a disease without addressing the underlying cause.
Exactly, Jennifer. So, from the perspective of those who support adaptation, the key arguments are that we need to prioritize practical solutions to protect people and infrastructure from the impacts of climate change, since some changes are already inevitable. But from the perspective of those who support mitigation, the focus is on reducing emissions to prevent the worst-case scenarios and ensure that future generations don't have to live with the consequences of our inaction. As we can see, there are valid arguments on both sides of this debate.
Absolutely, Elizabeth. And speaking of different perspectives, I think it's a great time to hear from one of our listeners. Let's take a call from someone who might have an interesting perspective on whether climate change is already irreversible and what we should focus on moving forward. Hi there, you're on the air with Jennifer and Elizabeth. What's your name and where are you calling from?
Hi, Jennifer. Hi, Elizabeth. My name is David, and I'm calling from Melbourne, Australia. I've been listening to your podcast for a while now, and I love today's topic. I wanted to share my thoughts because I work in climate research, and I've seen firsthand how important both mitigation and adaptation are in responding to climate change.
Hi, David. Thank you so much for calling in. We'd love to hear more about your perspective. Do you think climate change is already irreversible, and how do you see the balance between mitigation and adaptation?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that while some aspects of climate change are irreversible, like sea level rise, there's still a lot we can do to slow down the rate of change and limit the damage. I believe we need to focus on both mitigation and adaptation at the same time. Mitigation is essential for reducing emissions and preventing things from getting worse, while adaptation is necessary to help communities cope with the changes that are already happening.
That's such a valuable perspective, David. It sounds like you believe that mitigation and adaptation go hand in hand. Do you think there's a way to balance these two approaches effectively, or should we prioritize one over the other?
I think we need to do both, but it really depends on the context. In some places, adaptation will be more urgent, like building flood defenses in low-lying areas. But in other places, mitigation is critical to prevent future warming. The key is to develop comprehensive climate strategies that address both the immediate impacts of climate change and the long-term need to reduce emissions. It's not an either-or situation. We need to invest in both.
That's such great insight, David. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us.
Thanks for having me. I love listening to your podcast, and I'm excited to hear more episodes.
Thanks so much for calling in, David. Take care.
Bye, David.
That was a great call from David. He really highlighted the importance of balancing mitigation and adaptation in our response to climate change.
Absolutely, Jennifer. And for those of you listening, if you're enjoying our podcast, please like and subscribe to our channel. Your support really helps us keep creating these episodes and sharing more interesting topics with you.
So, where does that leave us in our discussion today? I think it's clear that while some aspects of climate change may be irreversible, we're not powerless. By focusing on both mitigation and adaptation, we can slow down the rate of change, protect communities from the worst impacts, and ensure a more sustainable future for everyone.
Exactly, Jennifer. Key takeaway is that even if some changes are already locked in, we still have time to prevent the worst outcomes. Whether it's through reducing emissions, investing in clean energy, or helping communities adapt, there's a lot we can do to manage the effects of climate change and build a more resilient world.
We hope today's discussion has given you some new insights into the question of whether climate change is already irreversible. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes, thank you for listening. We're always here to share new insights and help you learn English while exploring important topics like this one. Keep listening, keep learning, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Bye for now, everyone. And remember, climate action isn't just about reversing damage. It's about protecting the future.